Pleasure to be here today. As Bill said, I am a Hoosier born and raised, born in Anderson, Indiana, and I went to North Central High School. I went to Indiana University, and as a Hoosier who was, I guess I was an original Canatarian back in the 60s and 70s as a kid. And some of my influencers, folks who turned me on to the sacred plant, are here tonight. And in many ways, it was Indiana and, quite honestly, the intolerance for folks whose beliefs perhaps were not mainstream, whose lifestyles were certainly not considered mainstream back in those days. And, for those of us who were early advocates and adherents to the cannabis lifestyle, it was tough, right? Not only did you have to worry about the law and losing your liberty, but really it was about your social connections, right? So I come from a fairly conservative family, and for those folks, to be a cannabis user was something that really just indicated that you were a bad seed or a bad kid, right? And I was lucky because I survived my days at Indiana and went out and had a career in New York media and ended up in Seattle right at the beginning of the legal cannabis movement. So when I moved to Seattle and I heard that there were growers and processors and medical patients and advocates who were gathering together to try to change the law, right? And on the West Coast, unlike the conservative Midwest, there was a tolerance for cannabis and cannabis lifestyle, right? So in the 90s, we got medical cannabis, and it was tolerated, meaning that we had safe access points and folks could grow and become caregivers and use the sacrament as they saw fit. And it was tolerated but not legal, right? So that meant that the medicine that you took or the medicine that you provided to patients wasn't tested, it wasn't regulated, we didn't know how potent it was, we didn't really know what strains we were getting, whether they were contaminated with mold or mildew or pesticides that we shouldn't be putting into suppressed immune systems, right? And there was no testing, there was no labeling. You got what the man gave you when you could get it. And so that was okay until we really realized that, hey, we can demand better, right? That those of us as cannabis citizens have every right to live our lifestyle. So we started to organize in voter initiatives, and those voter initiatives changed state law. And still there was no industry, there was no infrastructure, there was no ability to grow product or produce product or distribute product in a fair and equitable manner, right? So we had to make it up ourselves. And the state essentially said, hey, you won the right and we will make it legal, but we're going to put up every passive and maybe not so passive resistant point so that you may not be able to build your industry, right? And so we started the Marijuana Business Association not to talk about the plant, right? Not to engage in political activism, although as a long-time normal supporter, many of us were already politically active. What we saw the need was, as we envisioned a legal, free society, was to have the ability to be normal business people, right? And so we wanted normalcy. So the last mile, even here in conservative Indiana, is not the legal fight. Although we're fighting the legal fight here in Indiana, this is the front line, right? And we've just now clawed, our first little bit of freedom with the CBD law, right? Which is too little and not really what we want, but it's the first step. It's the crack through which we will build the whole, which will become the portal for our progressive movement. And so, as someone who grew up in Indiana and fled for the liberal coast, if you will, It is my delight. I am so happy to be back in the Midwest. And my a good friend and sponsor and partner over at Curve Papers, Michael O'Malley, and I have been traveling the country, right? We've been going from coast to coast. So we started organizing businesses in Washington State, in Oregon, in California, in Nevada, and now we're in New York, and New Jersey, and Massachusetts. We just came from 6 days in Michigan, where we attended and participated in the High Times Cannabis Cup. And Michigan's medical is big and getting bigger, and they are preparing for a November adult use vote, and they're looking pretty positive at it, right? And then we went to Ohio, and Ohio is coming up against a 2-year deadline to start their medical system. And there's been corruption and inefficiencies and bureaucracy and every kind of passive-aggressive resistance to our ability to get this up and running. And so when I went to Cleveland with Michael last night, we had a room full of folks who were patients and advocates and business folks, and they were bemoaning the inefficiencies of the Ohio system. And they were saying, Rheins, you're crazy. Legalization isn't happening here. We're so depressed. Ohio is particularly corrupt, particularly inefficient. It will never happen here. And while I'm sympathetic to that point of view, what I can tell you from a perspective of someone who has traveled the country for the last 6 years working with grassroots communities is that it will happen in Ohio, it will happen in Indiana, and it is happening today. So what we're seeing, quite honestly, is the opening of the next phase of legalization, what I call the mainstreaming of marijuana, or the mainstreaming, the normalization of cannabis and cannabis users. Right? So a couple of years ago when I went to New York, or I went to the East Coast, they thought I was insane to think that we would have legal cannabis coming to the East Coast. Don't you know about the Rockefeller drug laws? Don't you know about Chris Christie? Don't you know about what's going on with Big Pharma owning the Eastern Corridor and all of our politicians? And I said, yeah, I do, but I am a creature of the future. I am a harbinger of things to come. And what I can tell you is, on the West Coast, and now coming on the East Coast, and starting in the Midwest, we have legal stores, we have thousands, more than 10,000 licensed cannabis companies, we have hundreds of thousands of employees toiling away in legal cannabis, as growers or processors or dispensary workers, bud tenders, trimmers, that kind of thing, and hundreds of thousands more who work in the ancillary businesses. That's everything from doctors and lab techs and sales guys and packagers and every industry, every facet of our life will be changed by legal cannabis. So here, as we await a judge's decision in a couple of weeks, right? To see if we can integrate legally cannabis into our spiritual practices, right? I'm here to suggest to you that the normalization of cannabis is speeding all around you. And folks like John Boehner, right, former Republican speaker, folks like Mitch McConnell, folks like Orrin Hatch, right? These conservative politicians are jumping 2 feet into the cannabis bandwagon. And what we have today in the Congress with not only Cory Booker's piece of legislation that says let's reform the Criminal Justice Act, which has used cannabis infractions as a stalking horse for exploiting disenfranchised communities, right? And then you have Cory Gardner from the legal state of Colorado, and Elizabeth Warren from the legal state of Massachusetts, and a number of others who have just come and introduced something called the States Act, which says, hey, even if we don't deschedule, even if we don't change federal law, let's put a simple piece of legislation together that bipartisan politicians can support that says whatever the state says is acceptable should be respected by the feds. We will not interfere with your marijuana industry, with your marijuana community, or with your marijuana standards. So from my standpoint, I applaud you all being here as, futurists, if you will. Folks who are embracing what will become, quite honestly, a general sensibility about a plant-based lifestyle. You know, the deity dozen is something that resonates to me, and I think resonates to all of us, right? And cannabis makes us more empathetic. I love the notion of accentuating the positive, and I'm here to accentuate the positive outlook for legalization, for normalization. And I know it's tough here. I grew up here. I understand the challenges of being pioneers, of being early advocates, right? You have to sometimes give up your liberties. You have to sometimes give up some treasure. You're certainly inconvenienced. All of the hassles of being changed agents is certainly something you feel every day. And I'm here to encourage you, right? Just like I said to those folks in Ohio and to the folks in Michigan, and that what we said to the folks in New York and New Jersey and Oregon before them, that change is coming. It's inevitable. You are part of the future. Stay strong, stay positive, give as much as you can to those who are in your circle, and just celebrate really the miracle and wonder of this plan. So thank you, Bill. Thank all of you for